So please join me in welcoming Susan.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and I wanted to express my thanks to Paula and Ellen and to Green College for this invitation, for this opportunity, especially to be able to drive out here on such a beautiful day, and to be in this place which has so much history and so much power. So, and especially so we need to up the amplification a little bit. All right. Thank you. All right, so is that any better? Good. Yeah, I really appreciate being able to have amplification. And if my voice does drop again, please let me know. So yeah, I'm looking forward to meeting you and to sharing this conversation about what I think is a very intriguing topic, and the fact that you all came to share a discussion about silence says something. So in preparing this talk, I decided to offer kind of several dimensions, not only to the topic of silence, but also to the way that I'm going to present. I'd like to offer you what might be a little more interesting in terms of context, a kind of abbreviated story of the journey that Jerry, my husband who's here, and I took when we decided to interrupt our careers and journey from Juneau, Alaska to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and begin this 3-year retreat. I won't go into a lot of detail. In fact, one of the goals is to normalize that journey, but have you come with me so that you can share the perspective of how that experience is something we can actually bring into our everyday life. It doesn't have, you don't have to make that literal journey, but what we learned there is very applicable to everyday life. So I'd like to begin and read 3 chapters to this presentation. And each of those 3 chapters will include part of the story of our journey into retreat. And it will also then drop down another level and talk about the practice of silence that's associated with that stage, and why that practice is important as a pathway or as a transformative process. And then just a very small addition to that will be just pointing to how that is part of the Buddhist tradition, for any of you who are interested in the Buddhist aspect of the story. So there's like three layers to each of the topics. So I'd like to begin then with the first example of silence. There's 3 different kinds of silence that we'll look at. And so the first kind of silence is what I call in my book positive interruption. And positive interruption is really a way of looking at the silence that occurs either intentionally or unintentionally to interrupt the momentum of our habitual patterns. So we have our ordinary life, our busy life, we're moving from past to future, we have habits, we have reference points, we're busy, we have a schedule, and then out of nowhere something happens to interrupt that. And in our life, those kinds of interruptions happen all the time. And often we refer to those as accidents, or they're irritating, or they're something unimportant that we have to get past. But the idea of an interruption being positive is actually a way of looking at the meaning of mindfulness practice. So what mindfulness practice is an interruption in the flow of our habitual way of thinking of time, which is actually somewhat mindless. We mindlessly are moving from the past to the future, without pausing to feel the depth of the present moment. So this phrase, positive interruption, is the practice of mindfulness, is the practice of actually reinterpreting. Here we have a perfect example. No, this is it's a perfect example. Thank you. So anytime there's an interruption in what you're doing can actually be a reminder of nowness. And I think this is right now one of the most popular and the most familiar contributions that Buddhism gives to, our conventional way of thinking of how to transform our lives, is to learn how to rest and relax and make friends with the present moment instead of continuously, mindlessly moving on. So it could be stubbing your toe, it could be the sound of a bird, it could be the shock of the beauty of the autumn leaves. There's all kinds of interruptions, and the practice of mindfulness is the practice of welcoming those interruptions and learning how to tolerate that gap that those interruptions create in our lives. Because we have a tremendous habit to want to get back into the flow of things. So, on a practical everyday level, a Buddhist practitioner or any one of us who's practicing mindfulness will actually take our day and interrupt it with a short period of time in which we do silent meditation. So we go into silence as a way of expanding or resting in nowness. It's a very advanced practice to be able to do that without going into silence. So the first form of silence we're looking at is the silence of positive interruption. So the example from our story is about 21 years ago, exactly, 21 years ago. As I said, Jerry and I we both had successful careers going. We had a home, we had a dog, our kids were just, the youngest one was 21, so it was like the opposite of the empty nest. And we decided that we wanted to take an opportunity to really drop into something completely different. And we enrolled in this 3-year retreat on the other side of the continent, because we were living in Juneau, Alaska. And so we made the journey, and we entered into this retreat, which was a group retreat. But we were separated. It was monastic. So temporarily, I became a nun and he became a monk. He's still got the hairdo. And in fact, it was Halloween when we formally entered our retreat. So we have these photos of me with my head shaved, and we're both wearing robes, and we're beginning our retreat, and it says October 31st. So nobody believes that it was for real. But we entered into this gap of completely not knowing. We had no idea what we were getting into. And maybe if we'd known, we would have had second thoughts. But so not only did we kind of leave our home, but we had no phone, we had no email, we literally had no connection with the outside world for that year. Nowadays, it's almost inconceivable. I had a friend recently who's a very advanced Buddhist meditator who said, I couldn't possibly do a solitary retreat without my phone. After all, what about my kids, And I thought, well, that's the way it used to be. So we went into this sort of crack in the world, crack in time and entered into a group retreat, and I'll say more about that in a minute because that's an important part of the story. It's not as though we were alone. I was with the women, he was with the men, and the gate closed with this big formal ceremony that meant we weren't leaving for that full year. And then we entered into silence. We entered into, now for the first several months, there was a period of time every day where we could have functional talking, so we could, work together and figure things out. But by the last 3 months of the first year, we were in complete silence, not saying a word. And that process of going into silence taught me the transformative aspect of that first kind of silence I'm talking about, positive interruption. That when you go as deeply as you possibly can go into interrupting your life and into the present moment, what you go into is a transformative journey that begins with, it's almost like a detoxifying process. Like, it's so irritating, it's so frustrating, it's so, it takes a long time to get past all the reference points of wanting to know what's going on. Again, it would be like putting down your phone for a whole weekend and not knowing. But gradually that stage settles down, and it's really paralleled in the meditation process. So when you sit down to meditate, whether it's for a whole year or whether it's for 10 minutes, you go through this process where at first you're very restless and distracted, and you're kind of detoxifying from all of that momentum that we normally have that keeps pushing us forward. And then gradually there's a kind of a settledness that begins to occur. And as that settledness begins to occur, which has a tremendous amount to do with the body, like being able to just kind of make friends with our embodiment, and how that embodiment starts to show us our connectedness to what's around us. That stillness. Then we move into the meditation practice of a more subtle kind of positive interruption. And that is, well, we've been able to create some space and some solitude from the point of view of the external world. Now we have to work with our internal world. And the mind is very, very restless. But the meditation practice is the art of learning how to touch thoughts and let them go. Touch thoughts and let them go. Touch thoughts and let them go. And gradually over time, when we learn how to interrupt, again, a positive interruption, we interrupt the train of thought, we can gradually discover what they call shamatha, or peacefulness, peaceful abiding. And so that's really the fruition of this first kind of silence that I'm talking about. A positive interruption can begin with the intention to actually go into the present moment instead of moving back into our flow or momentum. And then as we apply that intention to be present, what the transformative process is leading to this kind of making friends with ourselves in the most profound way. And the paradox, because each of these three topics that I'm going to share with you today has a paradox, as any of the wisdom traditions have. Buddhism is full of paradoxes. So the paradox is that once we settle into the solitude and the loneliness and make friends with that, instead of constantly trying to distract ourselves, that becomes the pathway to total connectedness, what we call interdependence or interbeing. And that's not just a concept. So for myself, for those last 3 months when we were in total silence, what I remember the most was just walking out, because we had a little bit of time every day to just walk out along the cliffs overlooking the St. Lawrence Sea. And by then it was springtime. We'd made it through the winter, which is another story. But that sense of actually being part of everything that was occurring, the sound of we saw the gannets coming and dropping into the sea, and the whales coming back after the winter, and the sense of joy that's beyond expression, but the feeling of being completely connected. And so I felt, because in my childhood, or my adolescence, even when I was a student here at UBC, I used to suffer from really severe depression. And that depression had a lot to do with feeling that there was some kind of wall between me and the beauty of the world. The sense of feeling isolated. And this transformative journey that I'm just describing now is like the exact opposite of that. It's the ultimate healing of that. You go into your aloneness, and through that aloneness, open up to, they call it egolessness, but that's too fancy a word and maybe too complicated. There's a felt sense of belonging, a felt sense that no matter what your life is giving you, whether it's painful or beautiful, that you can be there for that. So that's really the resilience that comes from that transformative journey that I'm calling the positive interruption. And so again, in our life we did it in a really radical way, but that's not necessary. The same kind of intention to drop into silence and to drop into nowness is what occurs when we make the intention to bring mindfulness meditation into our everyday life. So mindfulness meditation is really a structure for doing nothing, a structure for present moment, just being who we are. But in fact, in the more profound teachings of Buddhism, they say that when we do that, we're actually discovering a new dimension of time. That there's past, present, and future, and those are all concepts. But then there's something they sometimes call the fourth moment, which is being able to rest in nowness. And there's such a sense of authenticity that it's extraordinarily renewing. So training to do that is what we call mindfulness practice. So everyone's being very silent right now. But I thought maybe we could have an experience of that for 1 minute. It's not that unusual to have a minute of silence, right? But in this case, I can be silent because you're already being silent. And I'll just review with you what is often found useful for how to structure this experience of doing nothing. And so I noticed a lot of you already kind of reformed your posture. So people are familiar. Why do we have the posture that looks like the Buddha? The only reason for that, and I sometimes call it the posture of the 2-year-old on the kitchen floor, is because our bodies have a natural wakefulness, but the momentum of our life has changed our ability to come back to that. So we intentionally restore the wakefulness of our body. And in that wakefulness, we have a better chance of experiencing our wholeness. So the first instruction is to assume a posture. And some traditions say close your eyes. Some traditions say open your eyes. The tradition I come from says have your eyes just resting, gazing down, because they say if you close your eyes, you're much closer to sleepiness, which for some of us is a very close friend when we're trying to meditate. But on the other hand, if we're staring, it can be too distracting. So we just lower our gaze And the instruction is just park your gaze and then allow your mind to just rest. And even though we don't have a lot of time, but again, this idea that whenever your mind is moving toward a thought or an emotion or a sensation, that we just very gently touch that and let it go and come back to the present moment. And so that one of the most helpful ways to do that is to use your breath. Very helpful because it'll be there when we die. I mean, that will be our very last thing to do. So you can practice with anything. You can practice with a rock or a glass of water, anything that brings you back to the present moment, but the breath is very helpful. So in one moment, let's just attune to our body and then allow ourselves to rest, and then just feel your breathing. And when your mind gets distracted, very gently come back to the sensation of breathing. Okay? So I have my little gong here, and I have my stopwatch. Let's see if okay. All right, ready? So that wasn't very long, but it was a little gap. And we have gaps all the time that we can use. We have red lights. We have bus stops. We could even use the SkyTrain. Instead of looking at our phones, we could be just resting. So there's lots of little gaps, and if we consider those little oases instead of something unimportant, it's reversing the value, then, that's really part of this first practice of working with silence. So again, the outer silence can awaken an inner silence. That doesn't mean that we're suppressing our thoughts. It doesn't mean we're suppressing our voice. As a matter of fact, this practice is the opposite of silencing. We discovered that we've been silencing ourselves for our whole life. We've been silencing parts of our body that are calling out to us. We're silencing emotions. We're silencing ideas. And we're putting everything into the box of how we're supposed to be. So really, when you come into this experience of resting in silence, we're allowing ourselves to begin to listen to the body, listen to our emotions, listen. Our thoughts, what we learn is that this practice of interrupting our thoughts has nothing to do with suppressing our creativity. It's actually the exact opposite. Because we can have a period of time where we're coming back to the present moment, interrupting thought. But then when we arise, we are much more able to recognize a creative idea. I remember doing a sitting meditation retreat next to, I had interesting, two famous poets. One was Allen Ginsberg. I did a retreat next to him, and he used to have a little notebook next to his meditation cushion, and then he would write a few things down. But I also did a Zen retreat sitting next to Leonard Cohen. So I've had the opportunity to see for myself that some very creative people use meditation not as a way of suppressing, but almost allowing. So then I wanted to move on to the second example of silence. And it's a little bit like what I was just saying, and going back to the story of the retreat. One of the features of this 3-year retreat is that it is a group retreat. And so it's like having an arranged marriage with 7 people that you would never have chosen. That, you start off with the famous forming, norming, and then storming. You start off just being nice to each other and thinking, trying to figure out how to have space, how to have your own space, which is very, very difficult in that situation. But by the end of the first year, we were certainly full into the stage of, I can't stand this person, and if I have to be with them another month, I'm going to go out of my mind, and then multiply that by 7. So a really important part of the retreat was the next practice of silence. And at this point, we concluded the first year with 3 months of total silence, which is really where I went more into this solitude. But the next part was 6 months of silence. And during that period, we had to interact more, but we couldn't talk. But our interactions were more formalized, so it wasn't as though we had to figure things out together. But the daily practice was a practice called Tomlin. And Tomlin is a Buddhist practice which is very relevant right now, I think. It's a Buddhist practice for recognizing the way you project your own story onto another person and noticing the edge of your own tolerance. And so this is a form of silence that transforms our emotional reactions, especially our toxic reactions to other people. And it's, again, only through silence that we can recognize those projections as our own. And I found it incredibly helpful that these other women that I was in retreat with, in some ways we were moving through the space together without our normal conversations, because it wouldn't take that long for me to recognize my projections. We could write notes. So a typical example for me would be I'd be driven crazy by this person, and I really had to let her know all the rules she was breaking. And so I'd go into my room and I'd write, like a 9-page note. And then the gong would indicate it was time for meditation. And so we were meditating in our rooms. It was 3 hours of meditation. And the first thing I had to do was pick up my little book on Tomlin and read, just kind of randomly turn the page and read a reminder that would say something like, drive all blames into yourself. And so then there'd be a contemplation, well, I'm so right about this, and this person is so clearly wrong. How on earth am I going to blame myself for this, or at least absorb it? But that became the transformative practice. Because we weren't acting it out, because it was all occurring in the silence of my meditation, I had to recognize the degree to which I was continually creating a story about this other person. And then suddenly there would be this pop and it would be gone. And at that moment I would be so relieved that I hadn't given her the note before the practice. And I would go to at the conclusion of the meditation, I would tear up the note and I would just go, thank goodness I didn't. Because I would never have seen through it before I did that transformative process. So the practice of Tomlin is a practice in which you reverse the habit of territoriality. And what you do is you take yourself to the edge. You begin by contemplating that sense of interdependence I talked about earlier, recognizing that we all depend upon each other. I used to regularly in retreat contemplate that the good fortune, the privilege of being in retreat was at the expense of thousands of people who couldn't be there, and I owed it to them. You know, I felt like looking out at the St. Lawrence Sea in northern Cape Breton, you think of all the shipwrecks. And I thought, it's sort of like your family is still out on the boat and you made it to shore, and you've got to learn something in order to go back and help them. So there's this feeling of indebtedness, and then you take that kind of altruistic feeling and you apply it to the completely that squirmy, I can't stand this person feeling, and you mix the two together. And what you end up doing is you say, I will breathe in everything that I find uncomfortable about this situation, and I will breathe out all the goodness. So you imagine yourself to being like an air purifier, that you're going to take on the very thing that you would normally reject, and you're going to give away the thing you normally want to hang on to. And it has a very powerful effect of reversing the defense mechanisms that we think we need, but actually which poison our relationships. So that's a process of, actually the simplest way of talking about this in terms of silence is the silence of deep listening. Because every time any one of us listens to another person, we are actually engaging in this Tomlin practice. What we're doing is we're setting aside our own interests. We're setting aside what I want to say. We're even setting aside who I think you are. And instead, we're making the space for you to tell me who you are. I want to hear more about, tell me more about this. And that space is actually much more precious and rare than we realize. Most of us haven't had enough of that in our life. And so there's a sense of hunger for that space. But if we can learn how to deeply listen to another person, what Tomlin teaches us is that there is this edge. Nowadays we talk about it as the microaggressions or the micro-entitlements. You know, we have an edge where we turn the other person into an object. In my book I talk a lot about Martin Buber, you know, that when you turn someone into an it, and that's the edge that Tomlin works with. So we're becoming more resilient. We're learning how to go to that edge and expand further. So I often compare this phase of Buddhist training as being like training to be a first responder. You know, you're actually training to go toward the fire instead of away from it. And in this case, that edge I'm talking about is the edge of our own aggression, the edge of our own, how we objectify other people. And we go toward that and we take on what we're afraid of and we give away what we want to hold on to. So I'm not going to engage in that particular meditation instruction right now, but I want to drop back for a moment to the silent space that that comes from. And maybe we can have an experience of that. So going back to the end of the first story where I'm walking out on the cliffs of Cape Breton and feeling a sense of solitude and a sense of affection for the world. That space is what I call tender heart. That space is, in classic Buddhism, it's often referred to as shunyata. It's a space of complete openness, but openness that has an emotional texture to it. Not emotional in our familiar sense of a range of emotion, but emotional in the sense of complete tenderness, complete caring. You know, even we have that right now. We watch an autumn leaf fall, and there's just some kind of feeling about that. And that kind of feeling, that's the listening space with which we welcome another person. So when we're listening to another person, and you feel an empathy for that person, where you feel an interest in that person, where you just deeply appreciate in ways you can't put into words, that's coming from that space. So the second silence that I'm talking about as transformative is the transformative silence of listening, deep listening. So I thought what we could do, again, just very briefly, is to have you, if you don't mind, just turning to the person next to you for a couple of minutes, and just two things. Tell them, welcome them, and just ask them what brought them here, so that you can have this experience of connection to another person. We'll just do that for a few minutes. If the numbers don't add up, maybe there's someone behind you, but let's just see if we could do that for a few minutes. See, that could go on for a long time. Sorry to cut you off. It's an interruption. I don't know if it was positive. But what I'd like to do now is have another moment of silence and feel what that feels like. How is that different from just feel this quality of having connected to these other people? Does that feel different? We feel even just the energy in the room warms up. So I call that second kind of silence more of an attunement. That, it's like we start off with our aloneness and feeling this gradually growing affection for the world. And then we start discovering how that attunes us to each other. And I found that in that story of me and the other women in our retreat, that by the latter part of that year, I would walk down the hall. I thought of it was sort of like a stable with stalls on it. There was like a hallway and then there were 4 rooms on either side. But I found that I could sometimes walk down the hall and feel how each of my friends was doing. There was almost that sense of sensitivity where you could attune. And it was completely disappointing when the silence ended after that first, we had the 3 months and then the 6 months. And when we started to talk again, I almost felt like I lost that connection to them. So anyway, that was very interesting. So the second turning of the wheel of the Buddhist teachings is the teaching on shunyata, or an openness of exchanging self for other and dedicating oneself not only to peacefulness in your own life, but to benefiting others in any way you can. And my personal belief is that the greatest gift we can give to another human being is to listen to them and to truly make room for who they are. So that's why I wrote the book on mindful communication, because really that's the essence of where everything happens on a one-to-one basis. So that's the second story. And then the third example of transformative silence is a little bit more, it's interesting, I guess. And toward the end of the retreat, the last year of the retreat, the analogy was that we started off as a lot of vegetables and we ended up being a big soup. So, our individuality had cooked and all of our flavors were blended. And I think that was actually kind of a good analogy, because even though we still had our personalities and our styles, it was like a family that had been well nurtured. We knew each other, we made room for each other, we could accommodate each other's quirkiness. And we concluded the retreat with 3 months in which we did group practice from 5 in the morning until 9 at night, which was nothing but chanting. Chanting liturgies, chanting sutras, chanting prayers. From morning to night, we weren't having conversations. All of our voices were coming together. And what we were saying were these very high aspirations. So what I was contemplating is that the kind of ultimate form of transformative silence is when silence actually transforms into sacred sound, or sound arising from silence. And in the most profound teachings of Buddhism, they teach that in that completely awake space, there can arise a syllable, the very first sound, before words, before concepts, that there's a sound, a vibration. And that sound then precipitates, as it were, into form. But I think on an everyday basis, a lot of us love to listen to or be part of a choir, or be part of sacred chanting, love to go to the Alleluia chorus at Easter time. There's something special. Every tradition seems to have the quality of sacred chanting, sacred music. And so one would say, well, what does that have to do with silence? But I think it has everything to do with silence. Because silence is like the space out of which sound arises. So that, to me, was the sort of the third example of how we transform through silence. Because what we're actually leaving is our individuality. And what we're discovering is sound that is the space itself. Sound that arises as the space. And maybe even sound that, I was thinking of silence as being like a big empty mirror and the sound is moving through it, but it wouldn't be there without the silence. So that's a little more subtle, I guess. But that's what I thought. I was grateful to have Alan here as a music professor because he knows way more about this than I do. But also, part of that is we appreciate the sound that comes from everywhere. That we can actually rest in sound. So there's a very beautiful practice. Similar to what we did at the beginning, that instead of just doing the mindfulness practice, there's a practice where you can actually just rest and allow sound to express itself. Because the silence is always full of sound. And it's very, very, it could be quiet sound, but there's small sounds within space. The sound of, a fan, or the sound of the humming of a machine, or the sound of the wind outside. So resting in that space that is full of sound is, I think, another way of talking about transforming into sacredness. So I thought we could try that, if you don't mind. And I'd like to do like a two-part experiment or experience. The first is to just rest in the space we have right now and listen to the sound. And the important part of this is that you're not naming it. This is a great practice to do at home too. Like, don't name it. Don't say, oh, that's the bird, or that's the clock, or that. Just allow the sounds to just fill the space without knowing what they are. As if we're a brand new baby. Just allowing that. And if you go even further into Buddhist meditation, you begin to recognize the awareness itself as part of the sound too. So it can be very profound. But I thought that if we begin by just resting in the sound that's already in the space, and then at some point I will begin, and if we could actually, those of you who would like to, just allow your own voice to emerge with the sound ah, and we'll see what happens. And we'll just let that sound come into the space and discover what that vegetable soup is like. Just allowing that sound, and it might rise and fall on its own, and then gradually it will subside again. Shall we see what that's like? Okay. So we'll begin with there's no real strict timing here. We'll just start by resting in the sound, and then let's have the sound of this ah vowel emerge, do what it will as it kind of gathers all our voices, and then it'll settle down again. What was that like for you? So resting in silence, again, is something we can do anytime in the dentist's office. And just allowing whatever's arising to be this kind of vibration of our experience. And it's a gift that we can have for our life. So I think it's time to wrap up the talk and just kind of review the three examples of how silence and silent meditation can be transformative in different ways, and that each one of them is opening a new dimension, leading us to another possibility of how we can experience who we are and this precious life that we have. So there's a little bit of discipline involved in terms of being willing to go into that positive interruption instead of pushing it away. But it's really the discipline of kind of reclaiming the right to truly live our lives instead of being pushed through them by these habits of speed and busyness. So thank you for your attention and willingness to leap into these experiments. And if there's any questions or comments anyone would like to have, we have a little bit of time, I think. I don't know if there's a microphone or... would anyone like to offer your own thoughts about silence?
Before that, I think I'd like to say thank you.